The night was thick with the scent of myrrh and burning oil, the great temple of Heliopolis alive with the flickering glow of torches. The priests chanted, their voices rising and falling in rhythms as ancient as the stars. The gods were listening tonight, but so were men. Merneith stood in the shadows of a towering column, her linen robes clinging to her in the warm night air. She had spent a lifetime watching, waiting. Even now, as the ceremony for her late husband, Pharaoh Djet, took place, she felt their eyes upon her, the priests, the court, the nobles who whispered in hushed tones about what was to come. She was the great royal wife, the mother of the heir. But she was more than that. She had ruled in her husband's absence before. She had spoken in the halls of power when others dared not. And now, with Djet gone, the weight of the two lands threatened to fall upon her shoulders. A hand brushed her arm. "You should not linger," a voice murmured. In Tef, the old vizier, ever cautious. "They are waiting for you to weep."
To bow.
To submit. Merneith's lips barely moved. Let them wait. She stepped forward then, into the light of the sacred hall, where the priests bowed and the courtiers fell silent. She was not the picture of a grieving widow. She was composed, regal, her eyes sharp as the blade of the ceremonial dagger at her waist. Djet's brother, a lesser prince with greater ambitions, stood near the throne. His presence was a challenge unspoken, but undeniable. "The gods have taken Pharaoh," he said, voice smooth as polished stone. "The child Den is young. He will need a strong hand to guide him." The meaning was clear. Merneith let the silence stretch before she spoke. "Den is Pharaoh," she said simply. "The gods do not leave the throne empty." The prince smiled, slow and knowing.
"No."
"But men do." The challenge had been cast. Power did not pass so easily to a woman, no matter how many battles she had commanded from the shadows. No matter how many council meetings she had ruled in her husband's stead. The men of the court did not see her as Pharaoh. They saw only a widow, a mother, a barrier between them and the power they craved. She would have to teach them otherwise. As the last chants of the priests faded into the night, Merneith lifted her chin and stepped toward the throne, the seat of the living gods. She placed her hands on its arms and turned to face them. "Tomorrow," she declared, her voice steady, "the court will gather, and you will all kneel before Pharaoh."
It was not a request.
And for the first time, the men in the hall looked at her, not as a widow, nor a mother, but as something else entirely. As a ruler, as Pharaoh. The sands of time would seek to bury her, but she would not be erased. The hall was silent, but Merneith could feel the tension crackling like a storm waiting to break. She had drawn a line in the sand, and the men before her, nobles, generals, and priests who had long whispered behind closed doors, now had to decide. Would they kneel? Or would they rebel? The prince, her husband's brother, took a measured step forward, his expression carefully blank. "You speak boldly, great royal wife." His voice was laced with the arrogance of a man who had spent his life believing power belonged only to those with a spear in hand. "But the red crown does not rest upon your head." Merneith did not waver. "The red crown rests upon Pharaoh," she said smoothly. "And Pharaoh is my son." "A child," he countered. "And if a child sits on the throne, it is a man who must rule in his name." Murmurs rippled through the court, heads nodding, hands stroking beards. These were men who had followed Djet in battle, who had waged war against the desert raiders, who had built their wealth on conquest and alliances. They would not bend the knee to a woman unless they had no other choice. Merneith had anticipated this. With deliberate calm, she turned to the priest beside her. "Bring him." From the shadows, a young boy emerged, no more than 6 years old, draped in fine linen, gold cuffs on his small wrists. Den, the boy king, her son, the heir of the two lands. His presence alone was a statement. Merneith knelt beside him, placing a hand upon his shoulder. "This is Pharaoh." Her voice was soft but firm, carrying through the chamber. "And I am his voice." She stood then, eyes sweeping across the room like the blade of a khopesh. "Do any here dare defy Pharaoh's will?" The challenge hung in the air. Silence. Then, from the far end of the hall, a sound, the clink of metal against stone. A general in the back stepped forward and dropped to one knee, fist against his chest. "I serve Pharaoh," he said. Another followed. Then another. The tide was turning. But not all were so willing. The prince's expression remained unreadable, but his fingers curled at his sides. He was not a man to surrender so easily. "This is not how it is done," he murmured. "Egypt has never been ruled by a woman." Merneith's lips curved in a small, knowing smile. "Then let Egypt learn." She turned on her heel, stepping past him without another glance, her white linen flowing behind her like the river's tide. Den followed, his small steps light against the polished stone floor. Tomorrow, the coronation rites would begin. The gods would be called, the crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt united. And when the morning sun rose over the Nile, Merneith would rule, not as wife, not as mother, as Pharaoh. But she knew this victory was only the beginning. In the shadows of the palace, enemies still lurked. Some would smile to her face and sharpen their daggers in the dark. The men who had bowed today would test her tomorrow. Merneith was ready. She had spent a lifetime preparing for this fight. The first light of dawn spilled over the limestone walls of the palace, painting the halls of Abydos in hues of gold and crimson. The air was thick with the scent of lotus and burning incense as the court gathered in the Temple of Ra. The coronation rites were about to begin. Merneith stood tall, her body draped in white linen edged with lapis and gold. A collar of turquoise rested against her collarbone, the weight of power settling over her like an unseen mantle. At her side, little Den fidgeted, his small fingers tightening around the ceremonial staff. "Still yourself," she murmured to him, placing a steadying hand on his back. "Pharaoh does not show fear." He nodded, eyes wide but determined. The priests, robed in leopard skins, stood in a semicircle before them, their hands raised to the sky. The high priest of Ra, an aged man with a shaven head and piercing eyes, stepped forward with the sacred crowns. First, the white crown of Upper Egypt, its tall shape symbolizing rule over the southern lands. Then, the red crown of Lower Egypt, curling forward like a cobra, representing the fertile delta. And finally, the skent, the double crown uniting the two lands. The priest held it high, his voice ringing through the temple. "May the gods look upon Pharaoh Djet with favor. May Ma'at guide his rule, and may Isfit be cast down before him." The court echoed the blessing, but Merneith could hear the murmurs beneath their voices. She knew what they whispered: "The boy is too young. A woman cannot rule." She stepped forward, her hands lifting in a gesture of command. The hall fell silent. "Pharaoh Djet is young," she said, her voice firm, resonating through the chamber. "And as his mother, I will guide him. But make no mistake, until the boy can wield a sword, I am the one who wields the power of the two lands." A ripple of unease spread through the court. She had said it outright. No veiled words. No pretense. The nobles exchanged glances. Some seemed hesitant, others defiant. And then there was the prince, Djet's ambitious brother, standing at the back of the chamber, his face unreadable. The high priest turned to her, his expression neutral. "The gods bless Pharaoh's regent," he declared. It was an acknowledgement, but not yet an acceptance. Merneith met his gaze and took another step forward. "Not regent." A breath of silence. "I am Pharaoh in all but name. I hold the crook and flail. I command the armies. I keep the balance of Ma'at. My rule will not be questioned." The high priest hesitated, then slowly inclined his head. "As Pharaoh commands." It was done. The court, bound by tradition, could not openly challenge her in this sacred hall. But she had no illusions. This battle was far from over. As the crowd was dismissed, the prince lingered at the temple's edge. Merneith turned to him. "You look troubled, brother." He smiled, slow and knowing. "Only surprised." "You move boldly." She studied him, measuring the weight behind his words. He was no fool. He would not openly defy her in the halls of power. But she knew men like him did not sit idle when power slipped through their fingers. "Egypt has always favored those who move boldly," she replied, stepping past him. "The gods favor the strong." He did not stop her, but as she left, she could feel his eyes lingering on her back. The true challenge had only just begun. That night, she ordered the palace guards to double their watch. The palace at Abydos was silent in the hours before dawn, but Merneith did not sleep. She stood at the open balcony of her chamber, watching the black waters of the Nile shimmer beneath the moonlight. A cool breeze lifted the sheer linen of her robe, but it did nothing to dispel the heat of her thoughts. She had won today. The court had bowed, the priests had spoken the rites, and the boiking den had been crowned. Yet she knew that power was not granted by ceremony alone. It had to be seized and defended, moment by moment, breath by breath. The prince, her late husband's brother, was not a man who would accept defeat. He had spoken in careful words, but his silence after the coronation spoke louder than any protest. "He is planning something," she thought. And he was not the only one. A quiet knock at the chamber door. Merneith turned. "Enter." The wooden doors swung open, revealing Intef, her vizier. The old man had served in the court of Pharaoh Djet and now served her. He stepped inside, his staff tapping lightly against the stone. His lined face was grim. "I do not bring good news, Majesty." She expected nothing else.
"Tell me."
Intef took a breath. "The nobles of Lower Egypt hesitate to send tribute. Some say they wait to see if you remain in power before swearing true loyalty." Merneith folded her arms. "And the prince?" "He has met with several commanders of the western garrisons." Intef hesitated. "He will not strike openly, not yet. But he plants the seeds of rebellion." Merneith exhaled slowly, her fingers tightening against the cool stone of the balcony. It was as she expected. Power was never taken without consequence. "Summon the generals," she said. "At first light. If war is brewing, I will not wait for it to come to my gates." Intef nodded, but he did not leave. He hesitated, then spoke in a lower voice. "There are whispers in the temple as well. The priests of Seth grow restless." Merneith's lips pressed together.
"Seth."
The god of storms and war. Her husband, Pharaoh Djet, had honored both Horus and Seth, keeping a balance between the gods of order and chaos. But Seth's priests had never fully trusted her. Now, with Djet gone, they saw weakness. "They must be reminded where true power lies," she said, her voice cold. "Send word to the high priest of Ra. Let him know I will visit the temple at midday." Intef hesitated. "And the boy?" Merneith glanced toward the chamber where young Den slept, curled beneath linen sheets. Her son was Pharaoh, but he was still a child. The vipers in court would see him as nothing more than a pawn. "Until I am certain of our enemies, he does not leave my sight." She turned back to the night, her jaw set. They would not erase her. She had fought too hard to reach the throne, and she would fight harder still to keep it. If her enemies sought to break the hidden queen, they would soon learn. She was unbreakable.